By 1944, the war in Europe had reached a decisive turning point. Nazi Germany, once dominant across the continent, was now fighting on multiple fronts against overwhelming Allied pressure. In the West, British and American forces had landed in Normandy and were pushing inland through France. In the East, the Soviet Red Army was advancing relentlessly toward Germany's borders, crushing entire German armies in massive offensives. At the center of this eastern advance stood one of the most powerful military leaders of the war, a Soviet general who commanded more than 1 million soldiers in a single coordinated campaign. His responsibility was immense. He was not leading a division or even a single army, but entire fronts composed of multiple armies, armored formations, artillery units, and air support. His decisions would determine the fate of millions of men and the outcome of the war against Hitler. This general operated on a scale rarely seen in military history. The Soviet concept of deep operations required massive coordination between infantry, tanks, artillery, and air forces across vast distances. Unlike smaller, localized battles, these offensives stretched across hundreds of kilometers, involving thousands of tanks and tens of thousands of artillery pieces. The goal was not simply to defeat German units in isolated engagements, but to completely shatter their defensive lines, encircle entire armies, and destroy their ability to retreat or reorganize. To achieve this, the general had to manage logistics on an unprecedented scale. Millions of soldiers needed constant supplies of ammunition, fuel, food, and equipment. Railways had to be repaired, bridges rebuilt, and roads secured to maintain the advance. Every delay could allow German forces to regroup, and every mistake could cost tens of thousands of lives. As preparations began for the next major offensive, intelligence reports revealed that German forces were still holding strong, defensive positions across Eastern Europe. Despite heavy losses, the Wehrmacht had constructed layered defenses designed to slow any Soviet advance. These defenses included fortified lines, minefields, anti-tank obstacles, and carefully positioned artillery. German commanders hoped that by forcing the Soviets into costly frontal assaults, they could delay the inevitable and stabilize the front long enough to negotiate or regroup. But the Soviet general had no intention of allowing the Germans to dictate the pace of the battle. Instead, he planned a massive, coordinated assault designed to break through multiple points simultaneously, overwhelming the German defenses with sheer force and speed. The offensive would begin with one of the largest artillery bombardments of the war. Thousands of guns would fire in unison, targeting German positions across a wide front. The objective was to destroy defensive strongpoints, disrupt communications, and create chaos before the main assault even began. Immediately after the bombardment, waves of infantry would advance, supported by tanks and self-propelled guns. Behind them, additional armored units would exploit any breakthrough, pushing deep into German territory and cutting off retreat routes. The scale of the operation was staggering. Entire armies were assigned specific objectives, each coordinated with neighboring units to ensure that the offensive moved forward as a unified force rather than a series of disconnected attacks. But commanding such a vast force came with enormous risks. Communication lines could break down, units could become isolated, and unexpected resistance could slow the advance at critical moments. The German army, though weakened, was still capable of fierce counterattacks, especially when defending familiar territory. If the offensive stalled, the consequences would be severe. Millions of soldiers would be exposed to prolonged combat, supply lines would become vulnerable, and the momentum needed to defeat Germany could be lost. The general understood that success depended not only on numbers, but on timing, coordination, and the ability to adapt quickly to changing conditions on the battlefield. As the final plans were put into place, the general stood at the center of one of the largest military operations ever attempted. More than 1 million soldiers waited for the signal to advance. Tanks were lined up across the horizon, engines ready. Artillery crews prepared their weapons for the opening barrage. Supply convoys stretched for miles behind the front lines. Everything was ready. When the attack began, it would unleash a force so massive that even Hitler's armies would struggle to contain it. The outcome of the war in Europe was now approaching its final and most decisive phase. In the early hours of the offensive, the silence across the front was shattered by one of the most intense artillery bombardments of the entire war. Thousands of Soviet guns opened fire, at once unleashing a continuous wall of explosions across German defensive lines. Entire sections of the front disappeared under smoke, fire, and debris as shells struck trenches, bunkers, and artillery positions. Communication lines were cut almost immediately, leaving many German units isolated and unable to coordinate a response. The bombardment was not random. It had been carefully planned down to the minute, targeting command posts, supply routes, and key defensive strongpoints. For hours, the German front was pounded without pause, creating confusion and panic among defenders who could barely understand where the main attack would come from. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the artillery fire shifted deeper behind the lines. That was the signal. Soviet infantry surged forward in massive waves, advancing through smoke-covered terrain, while tanks rolled behind them, crushing obstacles and opening paths through the shattered defenses. The general commanding the operation knew that this first phase would decide everything. If the German lines could be broken quickly, the entire front might collapse. If not, the offensive could become a prolonged and costly struggle. As the attack unfolded, the scale of the operation became impossible to ignore. Across a front stretching hundreds of kilometers, multiple Soviet armies advanced at once, overwhelming German positions with sheer numbers. Tanks pushed through gaps created by the artillery, bypassing isolated pockets of resistance and driving deeper into enemy territory. This was not a slow, methodical advance. It was a coordinated breakthrough designed to destroy the structure of the German defense entirely. Units that attempted to hold their ground were quickly outflanked, while others were forced to retreat under constant pressure. German commanders struggled to understand where the main thrust of the offensive was coming from. As attacks erupted across multiple sectors simultaneously, every attempt to regroup was met with renewed pressure as fresh Soviet forces continued to pour into the battle. The general directing the offensive monitored the progress closely, adjusting movements and reinforcing breakthroughs wherever possible. His goal was not just to push the Germans back, but to trap them, to surround entire formations and prevent any organized retreat. As the first days passed, it became clear that the German front was beginning to crack. But the deeper the Soviet forces advanced, the more dangerous the situation became. The success of the breakthrough had opened the door to victory, but it had also stretched supply lines, exposed flanks, and set the stage for a decisive and brutal confrontation that would determine whether this massive operation would truly destroy Hitler's remaining armies. As the offensive entered its next phase, the scale of the breakthrough became impossible for German commanders to control. What had begun as a coordinated defensive effort was rapidly turning into a collapse across multiple sectors of the front. The Soviet general now shifted the focus of the operation from breakthrough to encirclement. Fast-moving armored units were ordered to push deep behind German lines, bypassing strong points and cutting off retreat routes. Entire Soviet tank armies advanced at full speed, spreading out across roads, railways, and supply corridors that the German army depended on to survive. The goal was clear: trap large German formations before they could withdraw. As these armored units drove forward, they linked up with neighboring Soviet forces, closing massive pockets around thousands of German soldiers. Inside these pockets, chaos quickly took over. Units that had been part of organized defensive lines were suddenly isolated, cut off from supplies, and surrounded on all sides. Attempts to break out were met with overwhelming artillery fire and counterattacks. Communication between German units broke down completely, and many commanders had no clear picture of the battlefield anymore. What had once been a structured front line had now turned into scattered groups fighting for survival. Inside the encircled areas, the situation became increasingly desperate. German soldiers, already exhausted from months of fighting, now faced shortages of ammunition, food, and medical supplies. Without fuel, many tanks and vehicles had to be abandoned, leaving infantry units even more vulnerable. Soviet artillery and air power continued to strike relentlessly, preventing any organized attempt to escape. Some German units attempted desperate breakout operations under the cover of darkness, but most were either forced back or destroyed before reaching safety. Meanwhile, the Soviet advance did not slow down. Fresh units continued pushing forward, expanding the encirclements and driving even deeper into German-held territory. The general commanding the operation maintained constant pressure, ensuring that no time was given for the enemy to regroup. His strategy was working exactly as planned. Entire German armies were being dismantled piece by piece, losing not only territory, but also the ability to function as an effective fighting force. For Hitler, the consequences were catastrophic. The forces he had relied on to hold the Eastern Front were now being destroyed at an accelerating pace. As the Soviet advance continued westward, it became clear that this offensive was not just another battle. It was the beginning of the final collapse of Nazi Germany's military power in the East. By the final stage of the offensive, the German front in the East had effectively ceased to exist as a coherent defensive line. What remained were scattered units attempting to retreat westward under constant pressure from advancing Soviet forces. The general commanding the operation now shifted his focus once again from encirclement to relentless pursuit. Armored units were ordered to maintain maximum speed, pushing forward day and night to prevent any organized German withdrawal. Columns of tanks and mechanized infantry advanced across vast stretches of territory, crossing rivers, capturing cities, and cutting off every possible escape route. Behind them, infantry armies followed to secure the ground and eliminate remaining pockets of resistance. The scale of the advance was staggering. Entire regions fell within days as Soviet forces overwhelmed what remained of German defenses. Supply lines, though stretched, continued to function through sheer organization and preparation. Railways were rapidly repaired, bridges were rebuilt, and endless convoys of trucks delivered fuel and ammunition to keep the advance moving. Every kilometer gained brought Soviet forces closer to the heart of Nazi Germany. For Hitler, the situation had become irreversible. The armies he had once relied upon were no longer capable of stopping the advance, and his commands to hold ground at all costs only led to further destruction of his remaining forces As Soviet troops pushed deeper into Germany, the final objective came into view: Berlin. The city was not only the capital of the Third Reich, but also the symbolic center of Hitler's power. The general now commanded one of the largest concentrations of military force ever assembled in a single operation. More than 1 million soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, were converging on the German capital from multiple directions. The final battles were brutal and intense, with German forces fighting desperately to defend what remained of their homeland. But the outcome was no longer in doubt. Soviet forces steadily closed in, block by block, street by street, until Berlin itself became a battlefield. In April 1945, the city was fully encircled. Within weeks, it fell. Hitler's regime collapsed shortly afterward, bringing the war in Europe to an end. The general who had commanded this massive force had overseen one of the largest and most decisive offensives in military history. His leadership, combined with overwhelming numbers and relentless pressure, had played a critical role in the destruction of Nazi Germany. The campaign demonstrated the sheer scale of modern warfare, where entire nations mobilized millions of soldiers and where the outcome of the war was decided not by a single battle, but by the coordinated movement of vast armies across continents.